Welcome to our second session in our cell evangelization series focusing on stewardship here at Transfiguration. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today as we look at the second pillar of stewardship, prayer. Now, I'm speaking to you today from the Rectory Chapel. As I moved into the rectory last summer, I knew I wanted to have a place that I could designate for prayer. And so as I began looking through the different rooms, I settled upon this one, which used to be a bedroom, to make it a space of prayer. And Archbishop Hebda was generous enough to grant me the privilege to be able to hold the Eucharist right here in this tabernacle to my left, to be able to have time with our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament each and every single day as a part of my prayer right here at home. It's one of the great privileges of being a priest that we have the opportunity to stay so close to the Lord in the Eucharist. And I would think that this might be one of the most significant ways to look at prayer. But before we get into the idea of the Eucharist and prayer before the Eucharist, it's kind of an interesting idea to think about prayer and stewardship. As I described stewardship in our first session, we think of stewardship about being the one who takes care of things that have been placed in his or her charge. As we spoke about the idea of hospitality, it was the idea that through our stewardship, we're able to more perfectly serve God and our neighbor. But what exactly does it mean to be a steward of prayer? How does prayer fit into this vision of our life as stewards? Well, I would dare say it comes from the idea of time. Time is a precious commodity, especially in a world like our own, where we put such a premium on schedules. Every single person in America knows how important it is to keep a schedule. And if anybody who's ever been a part of running a sports team, or whether anybody's had to manage others at work, we know that time is money. And that idea about how it is that we spend time is all-encompassing. Americans are particularly notorious in their focus on time. And so prayer is something that demands us to offer our time to God. To recognize time isn't just about making money or building relationships in our community or advancing in material progress. There's a part of time that has to be set at the service of the eternal. There's an interesting ironic quality here because time, of course, is completely antithetical to what is eternal. But if we use our time wisely, it can actually help us to escape the limits of time and enter into something far greater than it. The reason why we want to spend time in prayer is because it helps us to focus our life on the things that are beyond this world, to realize that our progress in life isn't something that can be just measured through what we do here and now. We have to look at everything with a lens towards eternity. Prayer really doesn't offer much in the way of great progress as far as how we might measure that in corporate America, or how we might even measure it in our entertainment. We think about progress as being about achieving something that can then be applied right now, or at least in the near future. But prayer isn't going to work that way. As a matter of fact, prayer transcends time. The prayer that we spend with God today is not going to necessarily have a benefit to us tomorrow. As a matter of fact, because God is outside of time, it's entirely possible that my prayer today is actually having a benefit yesterday. This is one of the more interesting concepts to bring to our prayer, is the fact that it allows us to take part in God's work and to know that what we are doing right now is being surrendered up to God to use at any point in time throughout world history. This idea of God working outside of time through prayer is certainly one that might strike us as complicated and unusual, but if we stop and think about it, I think we'll see that it really starts to make a lot of sense very quickly. Let's take, for an example, the very common Catholic practice of praying for the faithful departed. Now, many Protestants will say this is not a particularly good use of prayer because once somebody's died, they've gone to their judgment, and there's nothing left to pray about. They either are going to be going to heaven or they'll be going to hell. We'll sidestep the question about purgatory and how our prayers can be efficacious in that for just a moment to look at how it is that our prayer impacts a person's life even here on earth after the fact as opposed to simply just before the fact. We're used to living in a way in which we see causal relations going forward. So here on a Monday, I might go ahead and eat something, and then later that night, I have food poisoning and I get sick and miss work on a Tuesday. We're used to that sequence of events. But because we believe God is outside of time, it doesn't actually have to work that way. Prayer can have an impact backwards just as much as it can forwards. So when we say a prayer, for example, for our loved ones who may have died a year ago or 5 years ago, or maybe even before we were born, we might think about previous generations of our family and offer prayers for them on All Souls Day. The fact is, the prayer that we offer, say, on April 1st of 2025 can have an impact for that person's life on September 7th of 1875. Because God knows on 1875 what it is I'm going to do in 2025. And the prayer that I make today can be used by God in history as well as in the future. This idea of prayer helps to expand our understanding of the way in which the world works. And so we take time to pray because it allows us to see God working in His world in an even deeper way. So much of our life we can focus on the world according to just the laws of nature. But being stewards of prayer and having a deep and rich, robust prayer life gives us an appreciation that all of the world actually belongs to God, even something as interesting or as essential as time itself, and that God is Lord of everything, including our time. Now, it is extremely difficult for us to surrender time to God in prayer. Even I find myself often struggling to say, well, I could maybe give this time to prayer, but I could also use it for some sort of work at the office, or I could use it for my own delights. It's not something any of us, I think, readily wants to give away, because once we've given our time, we don't necessarily get it back. But I had a great experience of learning just how valuable it is to surrender our time to God in prayer, of all places, in Assisi, Italy. During my final year of seminary, as my classmates and I were getting ready to go on a retreat, we knew that we had a lot to be done before we could get back to the United States to finish our last semester. And I myself had one very specific big task that I needed to accomplish. During those days that we were going to be on retreat, I was planning to write a paper that I needed to turn in for a class that had been the previous semester. I'd gotten an extension for it as I was working on a major project, but the professor was requiring it to be turned in as soon as I got back from our travels during that J term. And so while I hadn't done any work during our time traveling around Rome, I thought the trip to Assisi and the time there on retreat would be perfect for writing a big, massive paper on the Holy Trinity. As we got into our retreat center for the very first night, and the leader of the retreat explained to us the rules of what we were going to be doing, one of the things he stated was that each and every single day, all of us was going to be required to make 4 holy hours throughout the day. Now, I had no idea that that was actually what was going to be expected of us. I figured for sure they'd want us to have a holy hour, plus praying the breviary and praying Mass and having our meals together, while admittedly in silence. But the idea that there's going to be 4 holy hours had never crossed my mind. And as I was sitting there that night, I thought, well, there's no way I can do this. I can't possibly do the 4 holy hours and write that term paper. And I prayed about it, and I realized, well, the Lord is calling me to surrender that time to Him in this retreat, and then to figure out on my flight home how I could write my paper and get it into the professor when I returned stateside. And as I went through that week, by choosing to spend those 4 hours of prayer each and every single day and not focusing on my work of writing the paper, I found a great liberation. And interestingly enough, when the retreat was done and I sat down to write the paper, I was able to write it all in one sitting. It was a long sitting, of course, but nonetheless, I was able to write it easily and quickly, and probably better than I would have had I been trying to write it while I was on retreat. My surrendering of my own time to prayer was actually providing a great benefit to me, and it enabled me to be able to do something better than I otherwise would have. That's the reason why we need to spend time in prayer. and be good stewards of our time by giving it to God in prayer. By praying, we get to be a part of God's work, and God gets to be a part of our work. Now, there's a wide variety in which we can pray. We can offer prayers of gratitude, prayers in which we express our sorrow. We can have prayers that are intercessory. We can offer prayers quietly. We can offer prayers out loud. We can speak extemporaneously, or we can cite prayers that have been written and composed by some of the holiest people to have ever lived. We can offer prayers as an individual or prayers as a community. But one of the key elements for us as Catholics is to appreciate the value of liturgical prayer. Liturgical prayer elevates my prayer by making it one with the whole church. When I pray with the church's liturgy, my prayer gets drawn into the whole mystical body of Christ. And of course, the greatest liturgy of all is the Mass. Now, I've stressed this point many times before because it really does merit our focusing on it time and again. The Mass is the greatest prayer of all, and there's no prayer we can be a part of that is better than praying the Mass. And there's an idea about prayer that's tucked right into the heart of the Mass that I imagine each of us has said many times, but maybe never actually sat down to really reflect on how deep it is. It's in the preface before the Eucharistic prayer. There's that dialogue that exchanged between the priest and the assembly, where there's a discussion about how it is that we approach God, and then the priest prays a preface before he starts the actual Eucharistic prayer. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and, through the wonders of technology, offer that preface dialogue to one another right now. The Lord be with you. Lift up your hearts. Let us give thanks to the Lord our God. It is truly right and just, our duty and our salvation, always and everywhere to give you thanks. Now, if that went according to plan, hopefully everybody in the group was offering the usual responses. And one of the key things is that final response from the assembly. It is right and just, to which the priest then responds as he begins the preface, it is truly right and just. To give thanks to God is something that is due to God. We have an obligation to thank God. As much as we approach God with a spirit of intercession, as much as we approach God with a need to express our own remorse, more essential is to approach God in gratitude. Everything we receive from God, even prayer, is itself a gift. And we really are simply returning back to Him something He has already given to us. We approach prayer with a sense of obligation, not in an onerous sense of obligation, but in a joyous one. Because by giving God our time in prayer, we are returning to Him something that He can use for the greater salvation of the world. The establishment of a life of prayer and rooting ourselves in it enables us to share in the workings of God for the glory of His Son's salvation. Now, I imagine I'm not saying anything people don't already know when I talk about how important it is to pray. We wouldn't be in these cells in our parish if we didn't realize just how valuable and important prayer is. But nonetheless, no matter how well-intentioned, we all can struggle with our prayer. Perhaps we find ourselves too busy, maybe we find ourselves distracted, or perhaps we're going through a spiritual dry spell and we think the prayer is no longer serving any purpose. To all of these things, I would only offer this advice. By persevering in prayer, by offering our time to God in prayer, we enable God to enter into our life even in invisible ways, which is why we shouldn't simply take time to pray, but actually make time to pray, to organize our schedules so that prayer is an active part of our life. Because by making time for prayer, we're opening ourselves up to the possibilities of what God has in store, and through our presence to God in prayer, become ever more perfectly heralds of His gospel.